Well, hey, thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is James Hawksworth. I'm the lead pastor here. And welcome to the Bridge Church at Bear Creek. We are so glad you're here, especially to hear from our dear friend, at least I consider him a friend, Oz Guinness is going to be sharing with us tonight. That was a nice pity. Yeah, that was very exciting. No, Oz is a great guy, and we're so thankful to have him. A few things. One, again, feel free. There's plenty more snacks and beverages out there in the lobby. Hopefully you're welcome. That was a fun little mingle time, wasn't that? It was a good time. So thank you again for being here. A couple of other things by way of this, and we'll talk about this again at the end of the evening. Oz is going to be talking about some fun things. So the way the evening will go, I'll introduce Oz. Oz will talk, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. A few things about Q&A time is we would prefer questions, not pontifications. Does that make sense? You know what I'm talking about? Have you ever seen? Don't be that guy, all right? Don't be that person, and then you just run. If you have a real question, please ask a real question, all right? Because I think we'll all get more out of that than sometimes an opinion that's sort of laden with a quasi-question. You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, can I get an amen on that? All right, okay. But we're going to enjoy that much more, and we'll have a much more engaging evening as well. And also, toward the end of the evening, you'll see in the seat pocket in front of you, if you're in the front row, you won't see that, but there's a thing called dessert and discussion. I'll wrap up the evening with that again as well, but this is designed to be a follow-up of continuing a conversation about some of the important things that Oz brought up and talking about that in greater detail. And so we'll give you some more information again about that as well later this evening. Now for Oz Guinness, huh? All right, so Oz, this is still my favorite part of Oz, is that he's the triple great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, legendary Dublin brewer, right? Oz was telling us the story of how when he was in Dublin, a man was so excited to see him. He kissed your hand, right? He got out of the car and kissed his hand because the Guinness family had done so much for the nation of Ireland. It's pretty cool. And supporting communities and lifting people out of poverty and providing good jobs. I thought that was a powerful story. But Oz really has become a great friend. Oz has lived quite an exciting and sometimes hard life as well, with his family being medical missionaries in China and being expelled there during World War II and seeing a lot of tragedies and things like that. But then going into London, where he went to get his, if you were here this morning, we talked about this already, but he went to get his bachelor's in philosophy and theology at the University of London. He would go on to the University of Oxford. Is it University of Oxford, is that right? Or Oxford University? University of Oxford, or University at Oxford, Oriel College there, and he got his doctorate of philosophy. So you're going to be listening to a brilliant man who's authored over 30 books. Some of you maybe have read some like The Call, which is one dealing with the question of life's direction and purpose. And also he's just having one that's coming out actually on October 2nd. And so if you find this evening instructive to you and enlightening, we encourage you to check out this new book. Again, this is like one of the only copies out right now, all right? Because it's coming out October 2nd, and it's called The Last Call for Liberty, How America's Genius for Freedom Has Become Its Greatest Threat. Ooh. Sounds interesting, doesn't that? Yeah. And so Oz tonight, though, is going to be sharing with us about the journey and how we as thinking people seek to find meaning. And you are in for a treat tonight as Oz has lectured all over the world. He's an intellect with a heart. You know, he's not just a brain. He's going to engage your heart as well as your mind. And he's a great man, and we're so thankful to have him. So let's give a warm welcome again to Oz Guinness, our friend.
Thank you. Thank you, James. It's the only church I've ever been in that served Guinness. Well done. Guinness within a few miles of Golden and Coors country. Wow. Pete Coors is a good friend of mine, so I'm always teasing him. I was telling them some stories last night about Guinness and Coors, but we'll leave those out because they're more fictional, some of them. But there's many true stories connected with our family and sort of comic things that happened because of beer. Our family became one of Ireland's wealthiest families, and they gave millions, but always as Christians, anonymously. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And there was one time when the city fathers asked them if they would help restore St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the biggest church in Ireland. Every year a flood went through it and it's almost falling down. They did it on the condition that what they did, there was no mention. But they did such a good job, the city fathers came to them and said, would they make an exception and allow a very discreet thank you? Somewhat reluctantly, they said yes. But when the curtain went back on the stained glass window, the city fathers, in their wisdom, obviously not taught by James and the pastors here, they gave their thanks to the Guinness family for what they've done, and they put a Bible verse at the bottom. And believe it or not, the verse they put there was, I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. Irish exegesis. But we're not here to talk about that tonight. A number of years ago, I was coming back from Brussels to London on the Eurostar. And if any of you have ever been there, you enter St. Pancras Station past a series of very dilapidated Victorian buildings with all sorts of graffiti. And amidst all the protests and the rubbish, there was this little clear saying, you only live once, and it doesn't last. So live it up, drink it down, laugh it off. You can't take it with you. You only live once. Now, you probably recognize that as the YOLO philosophy. You only live once. And he went through the American campuses very briefly a few years ago, and it is a kind of bastardized version of Epicurus. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Many people who followed that never actually knew one of the original formulations, which was, you only live once, if then. In other words, life is very short, and it can as easily be wasted as it can be lived to the full. Which, of course, raises the question, how do we seize the day, Horace's famous words, carpe diem? How do we make the most of life, if life is short? How do we make the most of it? Well, obviously, that assumes that we thought through what the meaning of life is. Reality, truth, human dignity, you name it. We thought it through so we know what the meaning of life is in order to make the most of it. You probably know Socrates' famous saying from his last speech before he was executed in Athens, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's probably the most quoted saying outside the Bible in classical literature. But if it's true, many, many people are leading lives not worth living. They've never really thought through, what is the meaning of life? What is a good life? How can I truly know that I'm making the most of it? You remember, if you've ever read The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, he ends up saying, what if my whole life has really been wrong? And the sad thing is how few people really think about it. I began to think about it in the way I'm talking about tonight because of 20-odd years ago, I had a suspected brain tumor. Obviously, it didn't amount to anything, fortunately. But I was in a hospital in the Washington area and about to go into an early MRI scanner. And the nurse said to me, are you claustrophobic? I said, no, but why do you ask? Well, she laughed. She said, our nickname is the coffin machine. Well, I laughed too. But when I lay in it for the first time, and then the second and third, it was as if I was lying in my own coffin in the dark with this clamp around my head, and so on. And the first time, it was as if my whole life scrolled down in front of me in Technicolor. I was born in China and had 10 years there, lived in Europe, lived here for a number of years, been most countries in the world, and met some fascinating people like Winston Churchill, Bertrand Russell, people like that. And my whole life just scrolled down in front of me and gave me an incredible sense of the journey. The journey is the most nearly universal picture of human life. Here we all are tonight. We are all somewhere between our birth, which we didn't choose, and our death, and we don't know the day of it. And here we are in between, making the most of this short stay in life, which is a journey. And you can think of how so much of the literature of the world focuses on that sense of journeying through life. Homer's the Iliad, Virgil's the Aeneid, Don Quixote, Pilgrim's Progress, all sorts of books, right down to Huckleberry Finn and modern books like Jack Kerouac's On the Road. They're all about the journey, and we're on it, making the most of it. Now, why do you think people don't think about the meaning of life? If it's that important, you think everyone, the unexamined life is not worth living, we've got to do it. But they don't. There are a number of very simple reasons, and it's worth asking if any of you are snarled up with these tonight. One is what the French mathematician and scientist Blaise Pascal called diversion. Busy, entertaining distraction. Now, when he talked about that, he was talking about the fact we're all going to die as humans. We don't want to think about that. As T.S. Eliot says, we don't want to bear too much reality. So we surround ourselves with all sorts of diversions so that we don't have to think about ultimate things like we're mortal. There's a book out currently called Weapons of Mass Distraction. Because you can see with our modern this, that, and the other, the triple screen living, and so on, a lot of modern people are so into their phones and they don't think about life at all and the wider world, let alone the meaning of life. And a lot of people are just surrounded by diversion. A second very obvious reason, maybe more men and business leaders and political people, is what has traditionally been called bargaining. In other words, the meaning of life is important, but later. When I've graduated, when I'm really getting going in business, when I've paid off the mortgage, when my kids are a little older, when I have time to think and I'm retired, it's always later, 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 later. Got so much to do now. But of course, one day, there's no more laters. And that, of course, in the Western world, where you had the figure of Faust, who wants more knowledge, more power, more experience. And so when he hits that final later of death, he'll bargain his own soul with the devil to have a little more time to do a little more whatever. But of course, the devil has read the small print, and Faust hasn't. And all the laters finally run out. But there are many people who have just put it off, put it off, put it off, put it off, bargaining with life. A third reason I often find is what you might call the noise, the personal noise in certain people's life. I remember a few years ago talking to a southerner over here who didn't want to talk about the meaning of life, faith, anything like that, because it always got snarled up with his dad. And he'd grown up in a family with strong domestic abuse of his father to his mother, and any discussion of that, oh no, and he would go off. He just didn't want to think about it. And there was too much psychological noise in his life, and so he just shut it out. So what I want to do tonight is talk about a thinking person's quest for meaning. And I want to stress, I'm talking about thinking people. There are many ways to come to faith, as there are people who come. But I want to talk especially about thinking people, because often it's considered that faith is for unthinking people. But of course, if you look at our Western history, many of the greatest thinkers, Augustine, Isaac Newton, many, many others, people of profound intellect and faith. Let me make clear too, I'm describing it as an invitation, not setting it out as a proof. I don't actually believe in those sort of things. The areas where you see proof in life, like mathematics or science or whatever, many of the deepest things in life aren't covered like that. You can't say prove love like that, and so on. but nor can you talk about faith in terms of those ironclad proofs. But I'm talking about an invitation to think through a thing in a certain way rather than any proof for anything. But let me set out, if you think over thinking people coming to faith, you can see 4 discernible stages. I don't mean everyone mechanically goes 1, 2, 3, 4, any more than you're in an elevator and you count the floors you're going through. You can flash from 1 to 75 in a New York skyscraper almost without realizing it. But in the same way, you can see thinking people actually think through that quest for meaning and the journey to faith in a certain way that's important. And any of you who are not people of faith, I just challenge you to think quietly to yourself, where are you in this particular progression? The first stage is always a time for questions. Someone becomes a seeker, a searcher, when life, for whatever reason, becomes a question. I don't know if you know the great British journalist of the last century, Malcolm Muggeridge. He was an older gentleman when I was a student, but we knew him pretty well. All his biographies say the same thing. Muggeridge knew what he disbelieved long before he knew what he believed. His story he described graphically in all sorts of ways. He said, I went to Cambridge for 4 years, and it was the most dismal years of my life. Education had no answers. He said, I went to Russia, everyone was going to the Soviet Union, and most of them were entranced by Stalin. He was one of the first people to see through Stalin. And he was disillusioned with politics. Religion must have an answer. He trotted out to India, for 3 years explored Hinduism, and came away absolutely disillusioned with all religion. And by World War II, when he was sent by the British intelligence service to Mozambique to monitor German shipping, life was meaningless. And he decided the only death he could procure in World War II was his own. And so he swam out one night, ready to take his life. But just before he went down, he looked over his shoulder and saw the lights on a little hamlet back on the shore. And for the first time, those lights in this little village signaled to him home and community. And he knew his despair was wrong, and he turned around and swam back. He became only a seeker. As I said, he was well known. He knew what he disbelieved. He didn't believe in anything before he knew what he believed. Now, our friend Sigmund Freud jumps in there and says, aha, you can see what faith is. It's wish fulfillment. It's a crutch. It's a projection. Someone has a need and they believe. No, Freud got it wrong. Nobody should believe because they have a question or a need. What they actually do is disbelieve what they used to believe because it no longer provides the answers. The questions raise questions of disbelief, not belief. But questions constitute the seeker. The great literary cynic, George Steiner, he says, Homo sapiens is really Homo quaerens, the animal that asks and asks. And the sad thing is that we ask questions as kids, and then we stop asking questions. But the seeker is someone for whom life has become a question again, and they know they need a deeper answer than anything they had to that time. My background is in the social sciences. It's a sort of commonplace there that every human needs 2 things, meaning and belonging. Meaning helps us to make sense of life. Belonging gives us a sense of security in the world. And if we have meaning and belonging, we have the launch pad for really making the most of life. But what is it that jolts people into questions or beginning a search like that? Well, again, if you think, there are very obvious reasons why people do. One obvious reason, the seasons and passages of life. It's a simple fact that most people think through those things in what Winston Churchill called the big 7 years, 18 to 25. adolescence today goes on into people's late 30s. So the big 7 has got rather extended. But you can see that there's no question that the college years or the early graduate years, for most people, are the years they meet their spouse, choose the direction of the career they're going into, and of course, make the commitment to the values and the worldview that they think is the faith by which they're going to live. The passages of life are very, very important. The second reason are the grand historical things. Solzhenitsyn called this the crowbar of history. You take, when I was a student in the 60s, you had thousands of Marxists on British campuses. But if you look at Marxism classically, I know we've got cultural Marxists again today, but if you look at classical Marxism, the first disillusionment was when people discovered the terror famines in the Ukraine in the 30s. And then, of course, the early reports of the Gulag. And then you had writers like Arthur Koestler talking, as an ex-Marxist now, as the God that failed, Marxism. But, of course, the grand contradiction of Marxism was 1989. And all over the world, as the Soviet Union fell, people gave up hope in Marxism. You can still find in some of the California universities good old 10-year radicals with hair down to their waists and so on, exactly the same as they were in the 1960s. But by and large, that's rare today. And if the people are left, they're the cultural Marxists and not the class. History, as Solzhenitsyn says, was the crowbar shattering their faith, and people looked for something better. But I've always been interested in the individual, personal reasons why people start to search, the triggers, the jolts. My mentor, Peter Berger, who died last year, he called them signals of transcendence. People have experiences which do two things. They puncture what they used to believe and point to something beyond, like a beep, 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 beep. If there's to be an answer, they have to search for it. He called them signals of transcendence. You know the English-speaking poet W.H. Auden, one of the greats of the last century. If you know his story, Auden, in his 20s, Oxford graduate, atheist, gay, radically left-wing, went out to fight with the Republican side against Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and he was very much in that. So he left Europe, 1939, and came to New York. But no television those days. How did you keep up with things? You went to the local cinema to follow the Pathé documentaries. And one Saturday he went in there. He didn't realize he was in Yorkville on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Most people in the room were Germans, because that was a German area, and it was very early in the war, to be fair to them. They were Germans, America was neutral, they were supporting their home side. And the documentary was on the siege of Poland, and Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children brutally. And the German audience cried out in the darkness, kill them, egging on their own fellow countrymen. Auden sat there in the darkness. He says in 2 minutes, his entire worldview was turned upside down. He said, first, I knew we humans have evil in us. I'd always thought, he said, that better education or improved politics or a little psychology, and we get beyond these irrational things we call evil. No, he said, I could see as I looked at that, we, and he included himself, have evil in us. But then he said the kicker was, I knew Hitler was absolutely wrong. Notice that word, absolutely. He said, all my life as a European intellectual, I'd said there were no absolutes. Everything is only relative. Only old fundamentalists believe in absolutes, but he said, I knew that he was looking at was absolutely wrong. He said, I left the cinema an unconditional seeker after an absolute on his journey towards faith, but only a seeker, no more, that stage. Many of you know the story of C.S. Lewis, hard-bitten atheist. And if you know Ulsterman, they're pretty hardcore. He was an atheist. what shattered his atheism was he had these experiences he described being surprised by joy. Fleeting little experiences of intense joy. He said they're not happiness. Hap comes from the word chance, circumstances. These are not happiness, nor are they pleasure. Pleasure comes from our five senses. He said, I had intense experiences of joy. And he set out to search for where this joy came from. He became a seeker. More than 10 years, but that's when he became a seeker. Or you may have heard of the great journalist G.K. Chesterton. He went to college in a world that art college in London, very like our modern postmodernism. He was cynical. As he says, he was flirting with the occult, a very dark, pessimistic view of life. Then he says, and he was always incredibly simple in the way he put things, he said, I was stopped in my tracks by a dandelion. Now you think of your Colorado mountains and the sunset. No. You think of a Californian beach with a margarita and a beautiful, no. He says, I was stopped in my tracks by a dandelion. He said, I know the world is broken and dark with horror in so many places, but the simple dandelion is so beautiful. And there are so many things that are so simple and beautiful still. How do you explain both the dark and the light? He said, I was stopped in my tracks by a dandelion. It was his signal of transcendence. Now, you give many, many examples. That's always the beginning. But of course, the tragedy is many people never even begin. At least the seeker gets to stage one and has a question that calls life into question, and they set out in terms of finding an answer. Taking a long time on that, let me move a little faster. Stage two, quite naturally and logically, is a time for answers. You've got a question, you want an answer. But there's a lot that needs to be said about that particular stage. This stage is quite natural. You're looking for an answer to a question that's really calling life into question. This stage is usually somewhat conceptual. In other words, if someone's tripped up by something that makes all the difference to them, what they do is send their mind out like a scout to look for the answers. They don't wear their heart in their sleeve. No. They guard the heart. They're not sure there are any answers. They're hoping they might find one good answer, but they guard their heart and send the mind out to think, to listen, to read, to investigate. It's a conceptual stage, very naturally. But also it's a comparative stage. There are all sorts of different answers. And the question is, which answer is the most adequate answer? But the third thing that's true of this stage, it's a critical stage because the answer will make a huge difference to the way you see life and the way you live life. There is a certain relativity in the world because we're all finite, fallen people. None of us looks at the world from everywhere. We all look at the world from somewhere. Only God, at this point we say if there's a God, only God has infinite knowledge and can talk of absolute truth in a strong way. We can't. We're finite, fallen people. There is a relativity. As many people say, you could look at a mountain. An ancient Greek could look at that mountain and see it as the dwelling place of the gods. South African mining engineer would look at the same mountain and think, my goodness, terrific. Minerals. You could go on down the line and a 19th century British climber would say, I'd love to climb that mountain just because it's there, as they said so often. Same mountain, but you're seeing it differently. Now, of course, at this stage, as you know well, we're aware of all the global answers that are on offer to us and our supermarket of possibilities in the world. How on earth does anyone look at them and decide which is adequate and which is true? Well, there are two reasons why actually the choice is cut down usefully. One is, of course, that every questioner, seeker, searcher has a certain question, not 1,001 questions. So I want the answer to my question, and so on. So the seeker's looking for something particular, consciously or unconsciously. But the second reason, and the more important one in some ways, why the search is cut down, is that while there may be, let's say, 1,001 answers in the room, you think I'd need to be a billionaire with 3 lifetimes to check them all out. There are actually only 3 big families of faiths when it comes to all the answers in the room. And by families, I mean faiths, worldviews, philosophies of life, which have a common family resemblance, because they all go back to the same sense of what's ultimately real in the universe. When you see it that way, the big 3, which cover almost everything, the big 3 are the Eastern religions, Hinduism, the old one, Buddhism, and varieties of the New Age that you see a lot in California. Now, they all go back to an impersonal ground of being. God with a small g, if there is one. The second great family of faiths is the secularist family of faiths. No God, no gods, no supernatural. Everything goes back ultimately to chance. I had seminars from Bertrand Russell as a student, what he called a chance collocation of atoms. Chance plus time plus matter plus energy, etc. And the third family of faiths is the biblical. Well, you should say today the Abrahamic. In other words, Judaism and the Christian faith, which are indistinguishable in the deep things, and then, of course, the one that's somewhat more distant and certainly more distorted, Islam, but definitely in the Abrahamic family of faiths, not the others. Now, the point is, they each go back to a different sense of the ultimate source of reality, so they come out in very different places. And the differences make a difference. And the seeker looks at them and weighs them and compares them, and contrast is the mother of clarity. When you compare them, you can see the different ways they come out. Now, we haven't time this evening to do that in depth, but you just take, for example, far too fast, and I challenge you to think it through for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Just take, say, human dignity. What is it in the East? You know the Eastern pictures of a wheel. Desire leads to craving, leads to attachment, which binds us to the wheel, and we go round. And the problem isn't you die, the problem is you go round again. Hindus say maybe on average 18,000 times. And freedom, as they call it, salvation, as they call it, is freedom from the wheel. But here's the kicker in terms of personality. What is the value of an individual? The individual bound to the wheel is caught in the world of illusion, Maya. So here's the point. Freedom is freedom from individuality, not freedom to be an individual. And the East has never given a high view of individual worth and individual dignity. Freedom from individuality, not freedom for individuality. When Buddha was enlightened, he didn't say, I am liberated. He said famously, it is liberated. He achieved what the Buddhists called the not-self. Or as one of his followers says, I am nowhere a somewhatness for anyone. Now you figure that one out. You simply don't have a high view of individual personality. What about the second family? After all, this is the faith of many of our professors here at your universities in Colorado and across America. How do they see it? Well, read all the atheists. Don't take my word for it. If the East says in 2 words, individual personality, forget it. What secularism says in 3 words is, do it yourself. Bertrand Russell was quite explicit. Everything comes from chance, so there is no meaning in the universe. None at all. So if you want meaning, you have to do it yourself. And his picture was of the Greek giant Atlas. You ever seen pictures of Atlas? He's carrying his own world on his own shoulders. Nietzsche says you've got to so live at the end of your life, stamping your will on life that you be able to say, thus I willed it. Ayn Rand, and I meant it. course, you can put it musically and it comes out with Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. No. Anyway, you can get the point. What is human? It's much higher than the Eastern, but it's do it yourself, which of course is terrific. Those of you who are young, healthy, wealthy, the world is your oyster. But for most people, that's a pretty tough philosophy. Then you move to the third family of faiths, the Abrahamic. We'll take the two that have shaped the West, the Jewish and Christian. The meaning of life, we are made in the image of God. So yes, in many ways we're the dust of the earth, but we have the breath of life. We are like the great unlike. And we have a precious dignity. So human personality is partly be who you are. Everyone unique, because made in the image of God. Partly become whom you can be, called by God. Creation is how you begin, calling is how you go on, and you have this high view of growth and the value of human dignity. Now, as you look at them, they are quite different. And what I've just done in far too briefly, you could do with evil, you could do with freedom, you could do with 100 topics. Just run them through the different families of faith, and the differences make a huge difference. And the seeker, of course, is saying, with my question, what is adequate? The key issue at this second step is adequacy. Adequacy. If I were to believe what this truth claim is, would it be adequate to answer my question? On to the third stage. A time for questions, a time for answers. The third stage, a time for evidences. Now, you can get very complicated here with philosophers, but you can equally put it simply. This is what the lawyer calls due diligence. This is what ordinary people in the street call checking it out. Philosophers give more fancy terms like philosophical justification and so on. You can get pretty complicated, but it's actually basically a relatively simple idea. Does the claim to truth fit the reality of the world that I see? So like, check it out. Now, of course, we're in a postmodern world, and the heart of postmodernism, there's no truth. So a lot of people just skip this stage altogether, which is very dangerous. Because you need to know not only that what I'm looking for is adequate, you need to know it is in fact true, and therefore substantial because it's true. And there's one of two ways that most people do it at this stage. One is to look at the big picture and the way a big picture fits. An example of someone who did that was, I mentioned G.K. Chesterton. Stopped in his tracks by a dandelion, and he became a seeker looking for an answer to life that explained the dark and the light, the brokenness and the beauty together, not one or the other, but both and. And if you read his story of his coming to faith, he's a pretty dramatic writer anyway, but when he describes this, it's like 2 pages of Archimedes shouting, "Eureka!" Because suddenly he sees in a big picture way that the biblical answer answers all his questions. Created by God, there's beauty in this world. God said it was good, very good, and still so much beauty in this world, in humanness and in art and in nature and so on. But with sin entering the world, the brokenness and the oppression and the victimization and the horrors that we know too well. It's both, not one or the other, but both. And no other faith does justice to the two of them in that same way, with a deep realism and a deep balance. And when Chesterton comes across this, the excitement in his prose is quite incredible. Someone who was very different was C.S. Lewis. And he came not in a big picture way, but a close-up, detailed way. And you've probably all heard the way he did. I mean, he's atheist, searching in Magdalen College, Oxford. And one of his fellow dons, who is not a Christian, says to him, "Jack, you should read the Gospels." Here's Lewis, a literary historian. He'd never really studied the Gospels in the way he studied any other text, Shakespeare or whatever. So he did. Now, his friend had said to him, "You want to study the Gospels, so you'll find this great ethical teacher, Jesus, love your enemies," and so on. And Lewis said, "Yes, I read them carefully," but his view was rubbish. Yes, incredible ethical teaching. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. But at the same time, claims which, if they're not true, would make him a nutcase. And so you have this contradiction between what's obviously beautiful and these extremely challenging things. And so you have to put these two together. Was Jesus of Nazareth a liar? And on the text, he wasn't convinced of that. Was he a lunatic? And on the text, the evidence of the text, he knew that was not right. Was he a legend concocted by his followers? He knew as a literary critic there were no marks of myth and legend here. Horror of horrors, you only had one other option. Liar, lunatic, legend, or horror of horrors, he was who he said he was. Lord and God. And Lewis didn't like it. Getting to that stage, he said, I'm the most dejected, reluctant convert in England. It was the close-up evidence that persuaded him, but people have to look at it for themselves, not just stand back and say, I dismiss it, but actually look at the evidence for themselves. But of course, that doesn't get people home. The last stage is a time for commitments. In other words, when a seeker's, however long, it might be a week, it might be 10 years or more, they see the questions, they see the answers, they see the evidences, but at a certain point, they as whole people have to commit themselves or not commit themselves to it. Now you can clearly see that that stage is not reason alone. It's not against reason. It's not the slightest bit irrational. It's been thought through very carefully all along. But it's more than reason. Why? Because we are. As humans, we have minds, and so we have reason. But we have emotions, and we have wills. And it's the three of them together that make the whole person that has to make the whole commitment. I remember reading once the story of a European who was in Kenya and had written something about faith and was trying to translate it into Kikuyu language. And he was showing it to a Kikuyu friend, a warrior, and the Kenyan said, you've chosen totally the wrong word. Your word for faith could be used of a European with an incredible rifle shooting an animal at hundreds of yards away. That's not faith. He said, our Kenyan word for faith is the word we use of a lion pouncing on its quarry and all four legs enclosing the quarry in a death grip. That is faith, a whole person with a complete commitment. But of course, even at that fourth stage, people can either fall on their knees, as it were, or turn on their heels. In other words, it is a free person's choice, even at that stage. And of course, when someone does come to faith, as Auden did, as Chesterton did, as C.S. Lewis obviously did, when they do come to faith, that's not the end of the journey. That's the end of the search, but the beginning of the journey as a way of life. And of course, that's what Jesus called his followers too. I am the way. It's a way of life. And so the end of the journey is only when we meet him face to face, finally. Now, we're at an extraordinary moment in world history. The United States, I said this morning, suffering its gravest crisis since the Civil War. Our Western world, after 500 years of dominance as a civilization, is in very evident decline. The search for a new world order and stability is badly faltering. And you can see that many people are fearful, many people are demoralized, and many people have just shut down and they're not thinking. If ever we needed people to think through individually, responsibly, carefully, the meaning of life and how we make the most of it, and in our Western sense, how do we make the most of human dignity, of freedom, of justice, of equality, of community? Huge questions are at stake. We cannot afford people whose heads are in the sand and are leading unexamined lives. And so I just say to you, wonderful people here in Colorado, don't fall foul of Socrates and be content with an unexamined life. For your sake above all, and your family's sake, but also for the sake of the citizenship of this great country. Think through the meaning of life and move along. You've got to do it for yourself. I've followed Jesus for 50 years. And the more I've known him, the more I'm filled with the gratitude and the profundity of wonder at what it means. One of my favorite little sayings from a hero is, way back, I'm never better than when I'm on a full stretch for God. I grew up in China, as I was telling the friends in the front. I was taught a very realistic view of life. Our family, we found ourselves in the 1940s in a terrible famine in which 5 million died in 3 months. My mother was a surgeon. They were running a hospital. 5 million died in 3 months, including my 2 brothers. We then moved to Nanking, which had experienced the terrible rape of Nanking, the most brutal massacre in the 20th century. So I was brought up and saw the first beginnings of the reign of terror under Mao Zedong at the climax of the Chinese Revolution. I was brought up to know that the world was a pretty crazy, turbulent place, and a lot of nasty things were happening, and you needed a faith with realism. But it was actually when I was later, my last year at school, that I really began to think things through for myself and began to read many of the great thinkers. Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus, who was my hero as a teenager, and on the other side, the Dostoevsky and Pascal and C.S. Lewis's. And I was convinced, thinking it through like this, the Christian faith is in fact true. But coming to know Jesus was quite different. And then following him for 50 years and seeing how you can go into all sorts of situations. I won't go into more of that, but seeing all sorts of situations where your faith is tested and proved and grows deeper and deeper in terms of wonder, love, and praise. And so I, and I'm sure many others of you in the room, would second the great St. Augustine in his famous remark in his autobiography, Confessions, where he prays to the Lord very simply, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. I hope every one of you will not leave tonight without thinking, have you found your rest in him, your way in life, and the meaning of life so that you can truly make the most of this incredible experience, a short life on this crazy old wonderful planet Earth. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, that was fun, wasn't that? Now we're going to take the big... I love this guy right here. I think we should open it up for questions. Don't you think that would be fun? Now, again, a few ground rules. May we remind you, pontification is for some other time, okay? But a good, genuine question is much appreciated because I think he's really smart. Don't you think?
Oh, no,
I think he's a learned man, all right? And we'd love to hear, and feel free. If you have some questions, Nate, where's Nate at? Do we have microphones? Or if you feel, or Dan, we have some microphones. Or if you feel strong enough and you just want to stand up. Or again, if you're so shy, we even have index cards at the end of some of those rows, or you can write that note and pass it. But thank you so much, Oz. Thank you so much. And we want to just now open it up for a time of questions. And so if you have something, you can just raise your hand, and we'll have a conversation.
I'm really not more learned at all. I've just been around the track. I'm in my 70s, and so been around the track a time or two more than some of you, that's all.
I'm going to turn the fan down, too. It's a little noisy.
Hi, Oz. My name is Kevin Cullis, and just more as a background, less of pontification, is my very first taste of Guinness was when I was in the Air Force and stationed in England, and was in Colwyn Bay in Ireland, or in Wales, and I had a Guinness there. So that's how my connection with you at the moment. As well as I was in the Air Force when the fall of the wall occurred in Germany. So, and then when I got out, and long story short, I read a book about the Guinness and God, and how as a business person they used their business to transform their town and the country, etc. And now I see that you're an author about entrepreneurship, and that's what I do. Is I'm an author as well as a columnist about Christian entrepreneurship. And long story short, how would you see entrepreneurship in the Christian community today?
Well, just a word. My ancestor, Arthur Guinness, came to faith through John Wesley. And of course, John Wesley, in the revival starting in England in 1739, touched America, it touched Ireland, certainly touched our family. And one of his principles was gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And so Arthur Guinness did that, and that was the sort of beginning of the responsible generosity that he built in. Entrepreneurialism, though, a lot of people think of that as a businessman's prerogative. But if you think of it, actually, the foundations of entrepreneurialism are in faith. In other words, the entrepreneur is someone with a vision who sets out on a venture, calculating the cost, prepared to take the risk. He is an entrepreneur. And of course, that does fit capitalism wonderfully. It also fits Abraham, or if you like, Hebrews 11. And the great thing about the biblical view of freedom, we are influenced by many causes, but we're still free. Which means that under God, we act into history, but always with an eye beyond the horizon. So you have this dreadful idea in America today. You've got to, if you're 50s and 60s, work for your legacy. You can pass on rubbish. None of us knows our legacy. Because much of what we're aiming for, and you see this in Hebrews 11, acting into history, but always with a view over the edge of the horizon in history. And it says at the end of that chapter, God loves faith like that. He's not ashamed to be their God. He's prepared a city for them. So actually the origins and the foundations of entrepreneurialism are in faith itself, and that venturous spirit at the heart of faith. So every Christian should be an entrepreneur. I call us entrepreneurs of life. Now, certainly a lot of businessmen have done it wonderfully too, but it's a great idea. Yes, sir. It's behind you.
I was wondering if you might address the concept of suffering in hell, and what aspect of God, why is there a need for suffering, not just separation?
You mean in terms of hell? You don't mean in terms of this world. Now, in terms of this world, that's very clear. In other words, when sin comes into the world, which is the free choice to do ill rather than good, to do wrong rather than good, it always has suffering in its train. Now, I'd be very, very careful in spelling out what we mean by that. And a lot of people, I think, have gone far too far in spelling it out and in saying who's included. We don't know. God is all just. God is all merciful. You see the challenges there that individuals have to make, and we should challenge our friends and so on to make those choices in the light of that. But don't go beyond what Scripture says in spelling it out. Now, in terms of justice, though, my friend Peter Berger, my mentor that I mentioned earlier, one of the signals of transcendence he mentions in a single chapter, fascinating one, is judgment. And it goes back to what I was saying about W.H. Jordan. But you take a case, the film on Eichmann that's out now. If you go back to the time when Eichmann was tried, many people were asked, what should his punishment be? And again and again and again, the answer came back, hanging's too good for him. Now, what do they mean? You can see when you're up against malevolent, malignant, chosen evil, people realize there's a responsibility there that goes beyond whatever. And I'm not going to say what it means. But God is just, God is merciful. I'm happy and grateful to leave it with him and not try and spell it out as so many people do, except to point out that longing for justice is a very, very profound one, that one day the last injustice of the world will be truly dealt with. The last tear will be wiped away. That's easy. But the last injustice, I don't know what that means. I really don't. But it's an incredible hope that's there in terms of the second coming of the Messiah. So I'd be very careful about going beyond Scripture. Many people do. I mean, we shouldn't, if we speculate, you should say you're speculating. And a lot of people do. Milton, Paradise Lost, is a grand speculation of how it happened. The Bible doesn't say how the evil one fell. It doesn't say a thing. Milton speculated, and it's magnificent, but dangerous stuff. And when you come to the end times and the final judgment, and people get all caught up in they hate certain groups and so on, very dangerous to speculate and say what's going to happen. So I'd be very, very careful in how we interpret that. God is all just and God is all merciful. Let's leave those questions with him, knowing that the final dealing of justice will be incredibly important to a new world. I'd leave it there.
Hoping maybe. On? Hello? I was wondering if you might address the whole concept of artificial intelligence.
Of what?
Artificial intelligence. The big trend now in developing artificial intelligence and the dangers that poses to the journey that you've just been talking about, and what our response as Christians might be to this trend in developing artificial intelligence.
That's my topic at Colorado Christian tomorrow night. So. Very briefly, when I was a student, listened to people like Bertrand Russell, we were hit with the ideas, 20-year-olds, we are now as humans post-Auschwitz. What does it say of us, the people who did Auschwitz and so on, humans like us? We're not only that, we're post-Hiroshima. Hiroshima obviously is not a moral equivalent of Auschwitz, except in the justification and the mutually assured destruction and madness and so on. Now, though, the challenge is we are not only post-Auschwitz and post-Hiroshima, we are pre-singularity. So if you look at C.S. Lewis, one of his most incredible pieces is The Abolition of Man, where he talks about the fact that the conquest of nature has now reached the point of the conquest of human nature, which will probably lead, he says, to the abolition of man. But it's interesting, he says in that, it will take 100 centuries. It's a long time. Kurzweil, Singularity is Near, was written 1 century and 2 years after Lewis. In other words, it's happened a whole lot faster than he imagined. And so we're looking at artificial intelligence. And, there's a fascinating book out this year by Max Tegmark. We're moving from AI, artificial intelligence, to AGI, where artificial intelligence can truly rival a human intelligence, to ASI, special intelligence, where artificial intelligence can outcompete us by thousands of times. Well, obviously, you've got incredible things being discussed in this, and we need to keep up with the discussion, but I will be arguing tomorrow night, we need to pit against it a powerful view of human nature. Because this stage of AI is creating questions that all raise the question, what is human nature? Why does the individual matter? But I think you can't just read the books. There are a lot of books you can read. I mean, Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, fascinating. Max Tegmark that I mentioned, Life 3.0. A very, very interesting little book by an Irishman called To Be a Machine, where he has a chapter, very simple, he's a journalist, on every one of these things: life extension, cryonics, whole brain emulation, downloading of brains, artificial intelligence, the one you've raised, robots, super soldiers, cyborgs, and then, of course, genetic engineering, cloning, and all that. And he goes into all of these and describes them. So we, on the one hand, need to keep up with the discussion. But more importantly than that, or equally importantly as that, we need to pit against it a powerful biblical ethic and a biblical view of the precious value of every single human being. Because if you think, much of the modern discussion, ethics, utilitarianism, the greatest good of the greatest number, where's the individual? Or say algorithms, the rage of all the stuff. Do algorithms have the slightest interest in you or me as an individual? No. And you go on down the line. So we have we have the highest view of human worth ever, which some of the AI people see as their supreme obstacle. But it's the supreme thing that could be the rescue of the human race. So that's actually tomorrow night's discussion. But it's a fascinating one, and we must be in the thick of that argument. Thank you.
So you mentioned a time for evidence, and this was the third bit in the seeking person's kind of journey, and that in that they were battling with truth, and that you mentioned that one of the biblical sides of that kind of discovery was this where light and dark meet and justice. And so let's say, just for argument's sake, that somebody makes a commitment to Jesus or that biblical reference, and then that light and dark, obviously there's a war going on, and that deception is kind of what the enemy speaks in. And you've been around the track, as you said, a few more times. And so you said, as you've been going through your faith journey, if you could kind of address how you combat deceit and deception and kind of keep that way, if you will. I don't know how to say it better than that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I was using it to describe what the philosophers call coherence, the big picture coherence. But if I'm understanding your question rightly, Scripture's so rich. We know it so well in many ways, we don't know it. Familiarity breeds not so much contempt, but inattention. And then a question is raised and an issue is raised, and suddenly you go back to the Scripture and you realize the profundity all over again. So I may be taking you wrongly, I hope not, but take, say, principalities and powers and the supernatural. A feature of the modern world is we live, Peter Berger's word, a world without windows. Traditional world, the unseen, and this is not just Christian, but pagan too, Christians and pagans both believe the same thing. The unseen was not unreal. But part of our modern world, the only reality is the seen. What you can touch, taste, measure, weigh, calculate, and so on. Quantifiable numbers and all that. That's the seen world. That's the real world for us, but not biblically. And then you come up against evils and forces that are so profound, you realize you can't just fight them politically or argumentatively or whatever. You're really taking on something of an unseen dimension. You look in the Scripture, again and again you have the little word, the Lord opened their eyes. Elijah's servant, panicking at the horses and chariots of the enemy. And then the Lord opened his eyes and he saw what Elijah saw all the time, Elisha rather, horses and chariots of fire all around Israel. You think of Daniel, incredible businessman, incredible position in the Babylonian Empire, but he was introduced to the the angel princes of Persia and so on. And I think there are angel princes today. But it's when you come up against realities in the world, you suddenly realize that my little understanding is too small. You go back to the scripture and you see something far richer, deeper, more profound. And so I've read the Bible probably once a year for nearly 50 years. But to my shame, I see things for the first time, the 51st time. Because I just didn't see the depth of it before. But something in life has raised a question that makes me see what's been there all along, and suddenly, wow, and so on. So faith grows in that way. So I think the church has got to, put it another way, the scandal of the American church. Church isn't doing well in much of the West. And the reasons for that. The scandal of the American church is this is the one country, with maybe the exception of Poland, where the church is a huge majority, but thoroughly ineffectual. Our Jewish friends, less than 2.5% of America. But to their credit, they punch above their weight in every area of life they engage. Magnificent. People I disagree with, say the activists in the sexual revolution, tiny percentage of America, less than 3%. But an influence in the country out of all proportion to their tiny numbers, and we who are huge are pathetic. There's something wrong. And surely we've got the humility to say, Lord, we can't be, if you're true and you have that power, etc., and we're so feeble, is it something wrong with you or something wrong with us? and well, I may be getting a bit further off his wonderful question. A lot of answers, but one of them is, one of the deepest answers that thinkers like David Wells or Gordon Conwell and I have argued for 40 years, the American church created the modern world through its ideas, but has fallen captive to the very world it created. So if you ask what are the problems in America to Christians, people will usually look at ideas and movements. But actually, the real problems are in the shaping power of the modern world, things like consumerism and so on, and the way they've shaped Christians without their realizing it, so they're not really living the way of Christ at all, shaped more by our culture than we are by the gospel. That's the deepest reason. If you put that in biblical terms, we are weak because we are profoundly worldly, shaped by the world. Now, when I came to faith in 1960, I'm in England. What was worldliness? Worldliness in the English church in 1960 was drinking, dancing, and smoking. Then came the 60s. Liberation, freedom, you name it. These were, quote, little no-nos. Now, I don't think drinking, I come from a brewing family. Our Lord drank wine, and Christians have drunk wine and beer forever. I never thought that should have been a no-no anyway. But all those no-nos were tossed out. Then there was no worldliness at all. At a time when we're more worldly than ever, but worldly in the sense we've been shaped by consumerism or shaped by this, that, and the other. I've got books on it. So the American church is incredibly weak, despite its huge numbers. What's the answer? Well, it's not the topic of the evening, but the answer is clearly, think of G.K. Chesterton's famous line, 5 times the church has gone to the dogs, and each time it was the dog that died. In other words, the answer is revival, reformation, renewal. But we have to look to the Lord for that and ask, are we really living as we should be? Now, you may know the story. I'm an Oxford man. We have a college called Linacre College, named after Thomas Linacre, a great scholar at the time of the Renaissance. He taught Sir Thomas More, he taught Erasmus, great scholar. He could read Latin, Greek, all that stuff. Well, you remember before the Reformation, only the clergy had the Bible. Lay people didn't get it. So he'd never read the Bible. But one day, one of the Oxford priests gave him a copy of the Bible in the Vulgate in Latin. He read it in Latin, read it in Greek, and he handed back the Bible with a very famous remark. He'd read the Gospels for the first time. This is just before the Reformation. And he made the famous remark, either these are not the Gospels or we're not Christians. Now, I think something of that needs to be said again today. There's either something wrong with the gospel or there's something wrong with us. And God forbid if we answer that wrongly. Yes, so do you have the mic? Yes.
I got the mic. Okay. I think earlier in your talk, you talked about the three different worldviews, the Eastern, the atheistic, and then the Christian. But I think you lumped Islam in with a Christian worldview.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I said they're families.
Okay, all right.
No, they're families of faith. So
Right.
There's huge differences, Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age.
Right.
And you've got thousands of differences within Hinduism, but they all share a family resemblance.
Okay.
And in the same way you have in the secularist family, naturalists, materialists, physicalists, you have atheists, you have agnostics. They're all somewhat different, but they all go back to broadly the same ultimate sense. Now, the third family, not Christian, I didn't say Christian, is the Abrahamic family, technically. So Judaism, the Christian faith, and Islam. Now, I said Islam, in my view, you have to discuss this very gently and respectfully. Islam is the most distant and the most distorted. But it's still part of the Abrahamic family. It's certainly not secularist, and it's certainly not Eastern. You see what I'm saying? A family of faiths. I didn't say it was a Christian family. Now, if we look at our Western world, clearly the two faiths that made the West were Judaism and the Christian faith. Our Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, he said that the Christian faith is Judaism for the multitudes. That was his way of saying it as a Jew. In other words, the Christian faith took incredible Jewish idea, made in the image of God. We add nothing that's not in the Old Testament. Freedom. We add very little that's not in the Old Testament. They are Jewish ideas that God revealed to his Jewish people, for which we're profoundly grateful. And we're incredibly close to the Jews, with the challenges coming where they themselves admit the covenant needs a covenant of the heart, and you have it in Jeremiah, a new covenant written on the heart. Well, when does that come? And so on. When is the gift of the Spirit promised in the Old Testament? Well, in the New. And we have discussions there. We've got to be very respectful. And my Jewish friends, one of them says to me, well, he said, at the end of the day, when we meet the Messiah, my first question will be, is this your first time or second time? And that's what we disagree with that one. But when he comes, that won't really matter.
That's pretty good.
So I have a
Sorry,
question.
where?
My name is Carol Giles, and my question to you has to do with within this framework of philosophical discussion. In your opinion, where does emotional intelligence fall? And is it not a viable way in which we can make decisions for ourselves when we become intelligent about how our emotions play out in our lives?
Mm-hmm. Of course. But I would say those of us who are people of faith need to ground that biblically too.
Absolutely.
In other words, one way of putting it is, if you look at the Western Christian discussion, it's been too dominated by the Greeks. And the Greek stress on reason was always at the expense of emotion.
Absolutely.
So the Hindu view of God and the Greek view of God are the same. He's what they call impassible. In other words, he feels no emotions. The Upanishad says the wind and the fire can't touch him. You know, I studied under an ashram for a while, and for a week I kept hearing this word neti, neti. Not this, not that, not the other, not the other. No words can describe God. He's always beyond, 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 beyond. That's Aristotle. So Aristotle's prime mover God is beyond all emotions. He's the, quote, unmoved mover. And a lot of theology has gone that way too. All mind and no emotion. And the Jews rightly have rebalanced that, although some of them fell for that too, like Maimonides. And if you read Rabbi Heschel, he argues that what we've missed is the pathos of God. So God is, yes, you have monotheism. He created the world. He's other. He's overall. He is only. That's the awesomeness of monotheism. But the uniqueness of the Jewish view, this God who is other, is passionate about his people and his world. And he's emotional about it. So the pathos, read the prophets. God loves. God is jealous. God feels whatever. The prophets are filled with words that are profoundly emotional. And of course, our Lord.
Well, I'm glad you look at it.
Absolutely.
That way. I would agree totally
In
with you.
other words, the danger is some people read just EQ. And that's a going thing, so they think, we must follow that too.
Well, I think emotional intelligence is something that even should be focused on in certain academic situations. Because if we don't have intelligence about our emotions, we can go very far astray without realizing it.
Yeah. But I wouldn't say
you.
academics in the whole are known for the balance. You know, you read Rodin,
Yeah.
the sculptor, and you read his description of the penseur, the thinker. And you've all seen his thing. He said, you look at it, you see even his toes are gripping. He's thinking with his whole body. And that's the sort of biblical way, not a disembodied mind. And we go back to artificial intelligence, it's Gnostic. It's a techno-liberation from the body, and this body of ours is embarrassing and decaying and all those nasty things. There's a rampant Gnosticism again, so I agree with you totally. But I'd love to see it come out in a full biblical way.
Right. Well, it's not like we, through the emotion of singing in church, it's not like we are saved by our emotions.
Oh no.
On the other hand, if we don't have emotional intelligence, what our saving grace is, the way we live as followers of Christ, can be negatively impacted if we don't have emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep. But I think the word intelligence will drop out of that one before too long. No, but give
Thank
us
you.
powerful place for emotions, right emotions. One more, or are we running out?
Dr. Oz, our government was founded with a Christian base, and we seem to have been losing that foundation in our government. Could you talk to us about what you see in the U.S., the direction of our nation, and what things you feel we might do to influence that?
I agree with you, absolutely. We've got to state it carefully. In other words, Christian America, or a Christian nation, sends shivers down the back of our friends, say the Jews. And I think a better way of putting it, and the Christian right has often stated it abominably, it is absolutely true that almost all the early Americans were Christians. It is also absolutely true that almost all the American ideas were Christian. That's absolutely true. But was America officially, formally, establishedly Christian? No. That's the genius of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment makes America somewhat of an audacious gamble, because the Republic requires ultimate beliefs. Otherwise, it has no roots of its rights. But the Republic rejects any statement of what those beliefs officially are, which means it depends on those beliefs thriving, and those beliefs arguing, and those beliefs prevailing. And if they don't, you're in trouble. So there's always, Washington called it the Great Experiment for that reason. Experiments are open-ended. The Puritans said you can either be a city on a hill or a story and a byword throughout the world. That goes back to, of course, the Torah. Choose life or death, blessings or cursings, and you always have that open-endedness. So we must never remove that. Now, where I agree with you strongly, I would argue, and this is the book that James kindly waived, there's no secret America's deeply divided. But why? Left and right, yes. Heartlanders, coastals, yes. Populists, nationalists against the globalists, George Soros and people, yes. But I would argue the deepest division is far deeper than those. The deepest division goes down to views of freedom and what the republic is. And you have some ideas that go back to 1776, which was decisively biblical as a revolution. I've said to several of you this weekend, how many Americans know that Constitution came from covenant, rediscovered by the Reformation from Exodus? Didn't come from Athens. So some of the ideas go back to the 1776, and they're decisively biblical. Sadly, they weren't consistent. You think of slavery in the Constitution. But many of the modern ideas go back to 1789, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and its heirs like Michel Foucault and Friedrich Nietzsche and so on. So from the liberal left out, you've got ideas that are fundamentally different. The problem is that unlike the last great time of division, the 1850s and early 60s, today there is no Lincoln. What Lincoln did, and you remember he went from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington via Philadelphia and gave a great speech at Independence Hall, and he said, all my ideas come from the two documents that were passed in this building. And he finishes quoting Psalm 137, if I'm unfaithful to these two documents, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So he addressed what he called the better angels of the American experiment and tackled the worst, slavery. No one's doing that today. Nobody speaks on behalf of the better angels. So, make America great again? Not asking what made America great in the first place. It wasn't power in the military. It wasn't power in the economy. It was ideas. And you're right, they go back to the Bible. So we've got to do a better job in understanding the American Republic, the American experiment, where it really came from, how it's changed, where things that were wrong, still are wrong, need to be confessed. But you can see even the way people are tackling wrongs. You know, from, say, Booker T. Washington right down to Martin Luther King. They tackled the evils of slavery and racism from a biblical framework. Take, say, the kneeing controversy. For Martin Luther King, the Declaration was a promissory note. Hadn't been cashed in, but it promised it, and so he appealed to it. Now they disrespect the thing that's the promise. Do you see the difference? You've got very different views, and that's why America's at a very fateful moment. Can't last terribly long.
In Oz, maybe one last question. Can I ask one last question? Since
you're the pastor.
I don't know. There we go.
You're the pastor. I may not get back to my hotel if I.
Yeah, I think you touched on that well, and that's really appreciated. How do we help then? We talked about this before, that this is potentially the most divisive time in American history since the Civil War. So what do you recommend as people here of either Christian faith or not of Christian faith? I think there's a mixed group here tonight. How do we handle our deepest differences? How do we handle these types of divisions? In the sense of civil discourse is almost an oxymoron, in a sense. What's the best way forward with regard to that? And what are some practical steps you recommend?
Well, the genius of the First Amendment, if you look at European history and American history, the genius of the First Amendment, it shifted American speech and discourse from coercion, European style, to persuasion. If people want to prevail, they have to persuade, which means you take the other person with respect, You know how to argue creatively when there are differences, but always in the context of respect. And in this case, you both are citizens. You have to discuss what the common good is and so on. But a lot of Americans are just responding from today's political positions in support of this leader or that leader, and you say Clinton or you say Trump, and immediately, you know, people just aren't thinking in terms of principles and persuasion and respect.
That's good.
And so on.
That's really good. Wow.
Have a book on that too.
You gotta tell us that book, Oz, real quick.
It's called The Global Public Square.
The Global Public Square. Get it on Amazon, right? Is that Amazon all right to purchase from?
Yeah.
All right, yeah, that's good. Well, I think, are we thankful for Oz tonight, my friends?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oz. I hope you enjoyed this evening. Again, we mentioned earlier, if you're interested in carrying on this conversation, we're offering what's called dessert and discussion. You'll see it. Is it there in the front of some of those chairs that have those? What, again, we'd like to recommend. Again, this is particularly if you are at stage 0 or 1, 2, 3, or 4 in your journey, as Oz talked about earlier. We'd encourage you, if you have deeper questions about this stuff, we'd love for you just to fill out your name and email. And then we have these little offering boxes along the back wall. You can just write your name and email. And we're actually going to be having a first follow-up session next Sunday evening here in our youth center, that cool A-frame building over there as well. But we are so thankful you came tonight. We hope you have a safe journey home. I think there's are there a few snacks left over? All right, so we mingled before. We can linger after. But thank you for coming. God bless.
James,
yes, sir.
I said it was wonderful to have a church that serves Guinness, but it's far more wonderful to have a church that thinks, too.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
Keep on.
Yeah. Wow. So, great evening. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon. God bless.